Hello everyone, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to be building the new 2023 V20c. Join us as we journey on here into the build. The V20c comes in a nice new box. Everything's included that you need to build the bike. Here we have our carbon fiber seat, we have our rear wheel and our front wheel, which are standard wheels, 142 and 100 spacing, by the way, 12mm through axle. We also have the chain, we have the rear seat yoke, pedals, and all of our little bolts and nuts in our little parts box. Also have our headrest tubes, and the whole rest of the bike will lift right out, all nice and padded. I highly recommend very carefully removing all your padding to reveal your gorgeous new Cruzbike V20c. All right, let's get started on this beauty. All right, you also need your Cruzbike toolkit, which has all the tools you need to put the bike together. I also highly recommend, as required by the carbon fiber, a torque wrench. Here's one we have a link through our site, I believe, that has all the items you need in it. It's available on Amazon. You really want a high quality torque wrench to be tightening these carbon fiber fasteners. Also highly recommend our wheel stand. Helps you hold that bike up. I'll show you that later. And here we have our different parts kits. We'll get to those. We have all of our parts for the front and the chain in one bag. We also have our seat hardware in another bag. Now note, you're going to take two of the nuts out and not be used on the V20c, so we'll get to that here in a bit. The first thing I like to do for this build video is we're going to install our drive side items, particularly the derailleur. I'm going to very carefully kind of undo our handlebar situation here so we can attach our rear derailleur to the chainstay. The fork is already installed, so you don't need to do any work there. We have our front through axle in the fork. We're going to remove that and make sure we remove the tool that sits in the end. The tool will prevent you from inserting it through the wheel, so always remove that. The fasteners are preset from the factory just to kind of hold tension. Our front cable there is installed. We want to make sure we're careful with that so we don't accidentally pull it into the tube. Now, first thing is to install the rear derailleur. Now, the nut that holds the rear derailleur is attached to the derailleur hanger itself from the factory. So once we maneuver our handlebars out of the way here, it's going to be very careful with these cables, not kink them. We're just going to set that aside for now. We're going to maneuver our front end down close to the fork. Now here you see our derailleur is already attached to the frame. The nut is going to go on the outside, and then the derailleur is going to go on the inside of the chainstay. So out of our Cruzbike toolkit, we're going to find our 2.5mm Allen. We're going to remove the nut, which is temporarily attached to the derailleur hanger itself. We're going to undo this little nut. Now, if you're using ball end wrenches, when you're using wrenches this small, I highly recommend only using the flat side on these small bolts. I'm going to install that nut on the outside of the chainstay. Now the derailleur, we have plenty of extra cable since we don't have our handlebars installed. So we're able to just pull it out a little bit so we have a little more working room, because it is internally routed through the fork and the headset. You'll see a little tab or a little nub that sticks out. That faces the outside. It only really fits in one way. So once you attach that hanger into the space on the back of the chainstay and line it up with the hole, that little bolt goes right back in, and we're going to tighten that. Make sure it's nice and snug. Don't strip the head of that bolt out though. Once we have that on, our derailleur hanger is installed, and that nut is also what the through axle threads into. I'm just kind of demonstrate here. So eventually this is going to sit like that over the wheel. All right, let's move our attention now up to the pivot clamp. I'm going to get my grease. You can use any bike grease or Vaseline, works in a pinch. We're going to remove the pivot bolt. Note the washers are on the outside. So to remove this, we're going to use two 5mm Allens. You might be able to just remove it with one since it's not super snug from the factory. But note the washers are on the outside of the pivot clamp, on the bolt and the nut. Very important. The washers go on the outside. Now I have my little tub of grease here. Your V20c comes with a nice small pack of grease, thread grease, that you can add. I always add some to the slide portion of this bolt. It makes it easier to get in and out, less likely to freeze up. So once we have a little bit of grease on that, we're going to slide it right in. And then we're simply going to insert the pivot clamp right through there, right through the bolt. We're going to line everything up. Washers on the outside, and use our 5mm Allen to tighten the bolt. Now we don't need to tighten it down all the way, just get it in there. For now, our final tighten will happen later when we're done. All right, now moving on, I like to use the wheel stand for this next part. So I'm going to put the wheel stand over here. You can see we can put our front wheel in with the cassette facing the proper side for the derailleur. And now I'm going to lift this whole frame and front end unit up right by the boom and slider, and just line up that disc brake and just rest it right onto the fork. Now note I can hang the handlebars right on the slider itself so they stay nice and secure. And I'm going to pivot this chainstay down right onto the fork. Line that up nice. We're going to pre-grease with a nice little thin coating of grease our through axle, especially the threads as well. And we're going to install this through axle, grabbing our tool. Again, making sure the tool is not in the end. Take the tool out, make sure the tool is out, and then install the through axle through the chainstay, through the fork, through the hub, and it'll thread into the other side. Now note, the axle of the wheel does not rest directly onto the dropouts necessarily. The dropout is just a guide for the hub, because the hub is actually resting on the axle, not the dropout. So you might have to wiggle it a little bit and maneuver it in there, but it'll go in. And then we'll tighten that down nice and snug, and then we'll reinstall our tool in the end of the through axle. Okay, now we're going to use our 4mm Allen. We're going to install our handlebars. Now, before you do this, make sure you make sure that these aren't twisted around the cables, because they are only going in one way. The drop of the bars faces forward. We should have nice, clean, unkinked loops on our cables like you see here in the video. And we're going to center the bar We're not going to worry too bad about the position at this point, and then we're going to reinstall our handlebar clamps. Again, we're only going to make these just snug enough to hold the bars in place securely. We'll do our final torque tightening later on at the end. All right, we have those secure. Now it's important to note there's always a gap. There's always a slight gap on the top and bottom of handlebar clamps. Here we have our torque wrench we'll use eventually to tighten down our handlebars and our other fasteners. The torque specs should be included with your V20c. We need to use this torque wrench for our final tightening for the handlebar, the pivot clamp, also the boom and slider clamps, and also the chainstay clamps up front. Okay, now let's move to the back of the bike and install this rear wheel. This is quite possibly a nice easy part. Take a break from the front end. Going to grab our through axle. You can also grab our little through axle tool out of the front of the through axle if you don't have it already. Put a little grease, nice light coating. Grease those threads a little bit. It's always important not to overdo the grease. You don't need a whole ton. Now we're going to simply just lift up this back end. We're going to remove this protector, this little spacer that's in there. Don't need that anymore. And then we can simply roll our rear wheel right in. Now having the front set up in that wheel stand, this really helps this step because everything is nice and secure and vertical. Then we're going to simply tighten that rear wheel down nice and secure. Always make sure your through axles are tight. They do have a torque setting, so you can use your torque wrench if you want, but my rule of thumb is nice and tight. Check often. And there we go, rear wheel and done. All right, now we need a 3mm Allen. We're going to loosen the Perez clamp with the 3mm Allen. And as you loosen this bolt, you're going to notice that clamp is going to lower down into the frame. It's going to get loose and lower down. You're going to lower the clamp all the way down to the bottom. The bolts are long, so you can't technically really remove the bolts all the way unless you really unthreaded them. So once that clamp is nice and loose and resting at the bottom of the frame tube, then inserting our headrest will be nice and easy. It'll go right past the Perez clamp. Now again, we're not going to worry about our final setting. We're just going to get it in there, and then we can snug down the Perez clamp. Tightening those bolts will pull that clamp up against the head tubes, holding the headrest. These do not need to be super tight. They only need to be tight enough to prevent the headrest tubes from moving. And later we can adjust those because there's holes in the seat. All right, we've got our seat hardware out here. We're going to take everything except for two M5 nylocks. So those are extras. We're not going to need those at this time. So we're going to just set those aside, and we have the rest of our hardware right here. Now we're going to take the bolts, two of the bolts with washers, and put them through the hole. Then I like to just kind of hold this and line it up and insert those bolts right through the holes. Keep the back of the seat up, and then holding the front of the seat down, then we can sit there and just line that Velcro up. You can use the holes that go over the Perez clamp as kind of a guide. Then we're going to take our M5 nuts and we're just going to thread these on just to keep the front part of the seat down. Going to install those nylocks on each side. And we're going to use our little 3mm Allen and our 8mm nut wrench that's included in your Cruzbike toolkit. Now the important thing is that these bolts, they only need to be snug, just about snug where you can feel the head of the bolt go through the end of the nut. They don't have to be super, super, super tight. Now we have our seat yoke. It's going to line up with the lower two holes. Now for this one, I'm going to add a little grease to the holes in the yoke itself, just to keep things a little cleaner. You can put grease on the bolt heads, or you can put it in the yoke itself, either way. And then we're going to simply put this yoke up against the seat. Be careful to try to line it up nice and close exact the first time, so you don't have to slide it around the paint. And then we're going to push the seat back down, and if we've lined everything up properly, the bolts should go right into that seat yoke. And then we're going to use our 3mm Allen to tighten them. Again, these bolts only need to be snug enough that the seat is not rattling or making any noise. I like to just do kind of a finger tight on each one, kind of like that. We're going to clean off any of our little excess grease here from our hands and get ready to install our seat pad. Now the seat pad has Velcro attached with a sticky backing. Now note the stick backing on this it does not come off, so you got one shot at this. So we're going to take our sticky backs off the Velcro. We're nice and happy with where we've lined up the seat on the front. Press those down, make sure you get them into the curve. And then just give everything a nice push down. That Velcro is not coming off that seat for sure. We have our headrest cover. This Velcro simply undoes on the back, and the top part of the headrest fits in the pocket. Slide it right over the headrest tubes and then attach those Velcro straps to the back. Now alternatively, the entire pad sock part can slide over the tubes. You can also play with different levels of thicknesses by adding padding underneath the sock to your liking. We have our seat and headrest is done. All right, let's move on to the pedals. So the stock pedals, you can use any pedals you like, but they are indicated on the inside with a nice little small R or L. So for the right and the left. Here we have the right pedal. That's going to go on the right crank, which is the drive side crank. Your right side is if you're sitting on the bike, left on the non-drive side. Always good to grease the threads of the pedals. And now in the other bag, with our front end parts, we have a couple pedal washers along with our adjuster for the front derailleur cable and the quick link. So we're going to take our pedal washers and put them on. Typically these are reserved for carbon cranks, but you can use them if you like. We're going to use our 6mm Allen. And with the left pedal, we're going to attach the left pedal and the right pedal. Make sure they're nice and secure. And that's complete. All right, okay, let's move on to the chain. So we have our quick links at the ready, and we have our chain. The easiest way to do this is to simply make sure that our derailleur is shifted all the way into the small cog, which it should be from the factory, but in case it's been moved since you've been assembling, just double check and make sure that the shifter is all the way into the highest gear. And we're going to just get our front derailleur cable out of the way for the moment. Make sure it's not caught up in the chainring or laying across the teeth or anywhere where it's going to get in our way too much. And we're going to pass the chain over the small ring, because our front derailleur should be in the small ring position currently. We're going to go through the front derailleur, and then we're going to drape it right over the cassette as our first step, making sure that on the cassette that the chain is sitting on the smallest cog. Okay, now I've laid the bike on its side just to show you this, but you're just going to pull the cage. The chain goes around and over the top wheel, the top jockey wheel, and then it goes behind the small tab. The derailleur has a small tab in the middle of the cage. You want to make sure that the chain is not going over this tab. It's got to go behind it. Otherwise, it's going to rub. And then it simply goes around the back side of the jockey wheel and exits the derailleur. Okay, now that we have the chain through the derailleur, we're going to grab our quick links and both ends of the chain. The chain is going to have a little tension on it, even when it's in the small combo. And we're going to simply put our quick link together like this. Helpful if you have another hand to hold that derailleur cage tension out for you. Now, if you can pull it, you can pull that chain link closed. If it doesn't close, another easy way is to simply route the chain until the quick link is on the top drive side, and then simply push on the cranks and you will engage the quick link. Now, just a quick note on adjustments. Your chain should be exiting the small cog pretty straight out from the cassette onto the jockey wheel. On every bike, there always needs to be some fine-tuning and adjustments after assembly. If you're not familiar with adjusting things like brakes and derailleurs, I highly suggest having this checked at a local bike shop to do kind of a fine-tuning for your shifting afterwards. But what we don't want is the chain coming off the cassette. Okay, so now let's tackle some front shifter cable. So the first thing you're going to want to do is do a preliminary fit to your bike. That means setting the pedal distance for your legs. Once you've done that, you're going to adjust the shifter all the way down. And then we're going to lift the hood. And it says cable right there. So what we're going to do, if you need to cut this cable, is we're going to push from the front the cable out of the shifter itself. And we're going to pull it. We're not going to pull it all the way out, but we're just going to pull out some distance of cable so that we know when we're going to adjust our front shifter cable, which is long from the factory on purpose, just so we can fit the really tall guys and gals out there. So here for me, for my X seam, which is about 42 inches, I'm going to want to cut a lot of this off because I'm going to have this go into the front shifter. So I'm going to pull out enough cable so it's beyond where my finger is. I'm going to cut this cable with my cable cutters here. And I'm going to take the cap off because we're going to reuse it. Now that's extra cable that I don't need, extra housing that is. So now we always want to make sure the hole is nice and open. So you can pinch it with your pliers to make sure. You can use a pick, like a toothpick or a metal pick, just to make sure there's no metal shavings or anything pinching the end of the housing. Then we push that cable back through and put our cap back on. The cable should be very free at the end of this cable. It shouldn't be any binding happening right there at the tip. So once we have this nice short length, you should have about 1 inch or 2 sticking out from the end of the housing. I'm going to pull it all the way through and add our cable tensioner for the front derailleur. And we're going to add our little small section of housing that's included in the parts bag. We're going to make sure everything is seated. And for your X seam, you will have a nice length of front housing that has a little bit of loop at the handlebars that matches the rest of the housing, and then this little section sticking out the front. And we're going to simply run this cable down inside around the pulley, and we're going to set the end of the cable into the cable stop right there. All right, once we have that, we're going to use our 4mm Allen to loosen the cable binding nut on the front derailleur. And then we're going to take our excess cable. We're going to make sure it's not wrapped around anything like the chain or anything like that. We're going to set it inside the pulley. Keep some tension on it. Again, make sure that your front shifter is shifted all the way slack. So you want all the slack pulled out of the shifter before we attach it. Now when we go to attach our cable, we want to make sure that the cable goes over the tab and into the groove. So there's a little cable groove. You can see the cable sitting in it right here. It's very slight, but the cable is going over the top of the tab. This is very important. If the cable is not going over the top of the tab and into the groove, then it will not shift properly. Some people route the cable under the bolt, and that is not correct. You want it to look exactly like this. You want that cable over the tab that I'm pointing to and in the groove, which is at a slight angle. It's not wrapped all the way around that bolt. It's very small. So we're going to snug that down. And of course later we'll have to do some fine tuning of the front shifting. But that gets us close and in the ballpark. We're going to bend that out of the way so it doesn't hit the cranks. And once we've done that, we can snip that cable. Be careful, nice and clean cut so it doesn't fray. Then we're going to put our cable tip on the end and then use a pliers or other tool to pinch that down onto the cable to prevent fraying. All right, we're almost on the home stretch. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to install our cable holder, which is a 3D printed piece that looks like this. It's going to go right up underneath the slider and capture your cables. All right, now that we're done with all that, we're going to use our torque wrench. And we're going to set our torque wrench per the specs here. Pretty much 5 Newton meters for everything, except for more for the pivot clamp. But we're going to use our torque wrench. Do not go more than the recommended torque settings. And then now that everything's set for our X-seam and our fit, we've done a nice fit. Now we can do a final tightening. We're going to evenly turn these bolts, kind of one at a time, little turns, each one. You don't want to tighten one all the way down and then the other one all the way down. You want to alternate so everything's nice and even. And you want to tighten these until your torque wrench clicks, and at which point then you've reached the proper torque. There it is. So we have our fastener at the pivot clamp. We want to torque down with the same using an M5. The other attachments to the pivot clamp are also have torque settings. Same thing for the handlebars. We've done a preliminary tightening and adjustment. And now that we're happy with our bar position, we can use our torque wrench to do the final tightening. Alternate, turning the bolts, making sure there's a gap top and bottom so that they're even. The surfaces of the clamps should not be touching. We have our little extension to do our chainstay bolts. They're pretty snug from the factory, but they can still move, which is nice during assembly. Now that our finally assembly is done and our fit is done, we can use our torque wrench to tighten these. All right, you have officially built a V20c. It's all ready for those final adjustments like I mentioned. If you are familiar with adjusting things like derailleurs and brakes, it should be close out of the box. Everything always needs a fine tune in the end. Once it's all fine tuned and ready to go and shifting great, you're off and riding. And as always, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, please contact us at support@cruzbike.com.